I have the singular honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Malinda Maynor Lowery. Dr. Lowery is Professor of History at UNC-Chapel Hill and the Director of the Center for the Study of the American South of Carolina. So I got to know Dr. Lowery over a series of meetings over the last 2 years about the experiences of faculty of color at UNC that then culminated in the roadmap for racial equity that has been widely circulated. Throughout that process, and even now, I am struck by the strength, the integrity, the decisive intellectual rigor she brings to these spaces. I am deeply grateful to be in community with her. While my own observations of Dr. Lowery are remarkably easy for me to articulate, I honestly struggled, and I'm being completely honest, to encapsulate the breadth and depth of Dr. Lowery's work into a brief formal introduction. She's exemplary of who and what a public intellectual should and can be, especially as members of a historically marginalized community. As a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, she has worked both through academic and non-academic venues to make Native and Indigenous lives visible, documenting the histories, the stories, and the lived experiences of the Lumbee people. Her first book, Lumbee Indians in the Jim Crow South, Race, Identity, and the Making of a Nation, published in 2010, won several awards, including Best First Book in Native American and Indigenous Studies, and is actually really delightful to read. Her second book, The Lumbee Indians, An American Struggle, was published by UNC Press in 2018. The book is a survey of Lumbee history from the 18th century to the present, written for a general audience. Dr. Lowery is also an award-winning documentary film producer. This includes a Peabody Award-winning A Chef's Life on PBS, the Emmy-nominated Private Violence on HBO, and films that have premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. Continuing this practice of combining the visual and the archival in her work, Dr. Lowery is currently collaborating with the Smithsonian National Museum of American History on a film for their new permanent exhibit, and is also planning a book about Black and Indigenous histories. Please know that this is a wildly incomplete encapsulation of the remarkable body of work that Dr. Lowery has and continues to produce in order to make visible how racisms are produced, how they coalesce, and the importance of collaboration and community building. To learn more about her work, please visit her website, read her books, and watch her documentaries. But before doing all of that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Malinda Maynor Lowery as she delivers the keynote for MURAP 2020 titled The Shared Past and Present of Black and Indigenous People in the United States. Over to you, Dr. Lowery.
Thank you. It's so, when Dr. Nguyen called me to invite me to do this, I was so thrilled and honored and humbled because of everyone on this call and the history that MURAP has at our university and the incredible work that is done every single year and the contributions that the program has made to our academic and non-academic communities. So thank you to everybody who's organized this, Benita and everyone. I appreciate it. The sort of subtitle of my talk is How Do We Get Free? And I want to start off with a quote by none other than James Baldwin, of course. He wrote, "Societies never know it, but the war of an artist with his society is a lover's war. And he does at his best what lovers do, which is to reveal the beloved to himself, and with that revelation to make freedom real." So this new project, a series of essays and maybe a book eventually, is to imagine our descendants telling their descendants about a time in the past when this concept called race existed and how we freed ourselves of it. And so I thought I might share a talk today that I wish I had heard as an undergraduate, a talk that I actually didn't know that I needed to hear as an undergraduate. And I've been writing and making films about place and race and indigeneity my whole career, but this work acquired a new urgency after 2015. That year, anti-racist student activists campaigned to rename a building after a Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon. The building was first named after the Grand Dragon. And at first, to contextualize a Confederate statue on UNC's campus that had been erected in 1913, not in honor of the Confederate dead, because they were already memorialized on campus, but in praise to white supremacy. Those monuments stood right alongside other kinds of UNC symbols, posters and banners and websites with photographs depicting the campus as a multicultural utopia, topped off with a multi-billion-dollar fundraising campaign with the tagline, Carolina for All. The hypocrisy of these two types of iconography about the campus's values was unbearable, alongside declining enrollments for Blacks, the denial of legitimate campus space for Latinx programs, the lack of recognition of Asian American studies as a field, and a rising tide of awareness of the campus's sexual assault culture. Students decided to do something about it, and protests began alongside meetings with decision makers. Administrators seemed to ignore calls for adding a plaque to the statue to present its proper context. They agreed to rename the building, but our board of trustees placed a moratorium on renaming any more buildings. The administration formed a history task force, which began a research endeavor to add an exhibit to the renamed building that detailed the history of Klan activity, white supremacy, and UNC's complicity in it during Jim Crow. Their other work, most especially adding appropriate context to the Confederate statue, was very slow, and the campus community knew little about what progress had been made. Then, protests against the monument escalated after white supremacists killed an anti-monument activist in Charlottesville, Virginia. UNC-Chapel Hill administrators followed by refusing to heed calls from the campus community and even North Carolina's governor to take the monument down. The chancellor at that time, Carolina's first woman in office, insisted that she did not have the legal authority to remove it because a North Carolina state law prohibited the removal of so-called objects of veneration on public property. After a year of outrage, where student-led protests continued and nearly every department, professional school, and organization on campus issued some kind of statement calling for the monument's contextualization in place, its removal to an appropriate site other than the university's front door, or its removal from campus entirely, the administration seemed to do nothing. I had been a bystander for most of these events, sympathetic, but believing the course of action was not in my lane, that the long arc of history proved that students were best suited to make change and that my role as an educator was to educate rather than advocate. The Center for the Study of the American South, which I direct, issued a statement condemning the violence at Charlottesville, and we held a public forum on the issue that sought to better explain to a Chapel Hill audience what had happened in Charlottesville and what this issue was about all over the country and the world. Privately, I was content to repeat shoulder-shrugging platitudes to myself that helped make sense of the situation on the surface and help myself feel superior to all those who didn't get it. These chestnuts included Edmund Burke's famous line, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Or when John F. Kennedy said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Those abstract meditations are premised on the idea that the problem is someone else's to solve, that the problem is others, not us. They kept me in a state of sleepwalking, believing that as long as I was personally willing to support the individuals involved, and that I personally believed that contextualizing the statue was the right thing to do, I needed to do no more than stay informed and try to explain to the closed-minded and open-minded alike what the fuss was all about. Gradually, I remembered Martin Luther King Jr.'s less abstract analysis, that the true obstacle to freedom was not the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who loved order more than justice. King observed that shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. I was surrounded by people of goodwill who could not understand the student's oft-repeated statement that the statue was violence. A statue never hurt anyone. I can understand that it represents violence, but how can it be violence? What dawned on me was that these folks had no appreciation of the many forms that violence takes. My own research in Indigenous history has demonstrated a proliferation of methods of violence. The variety of violence experienced in my home community is stunning. So is the variety of joy, of care, and of accountability. People at UNC's campus, on the faculty mostly, did not connect, for example, that the United Nations definition of genocide includes forms of abuse that are mental, spiritual, and emotional, not just physical. If the UN considers this type of iconography violent, why can't UNC faculty? And if I'm UNC faculty, then the problem is not others, it's me, because I'm part of the community. In the spring of 2018, I came to fully realize that unless I used my research to intervene on behalf of people who are actively harmed, then I remain part of the problem. Maya Little, a graduate student in my own department who had been active in the protests, doused the statue in red paint and a smear of blood from their own hand on the last day of classes in April 2018, a bucolic spring day. They were arrested and charged. Rather suddenly, I stopped walking and sleeping at the same time. The significance of their act became clear to me, and I knew what I had to say about it. This was a baptism in blood, a symbolic and literal, a spiritual act that resonated with my Lumbee family and our ancestors' generations of commitment to personal sacrifice for the improvement of the whole, to renewal, and to recommitment to our own values. That perpetual recommitment, observed through rituals around death, was how our Lumbee people spiritually survived through our Holocaust. And now Maya and the activists around them made it plain for me to see. I was thankful, so I expressed my thanks by writing an editorial for the local newspaper, and I therefore spoke to a broader audience than my immediate circle about the issue. Students taught me so much, and they didn't have to. My gratitude for that education led me to humble myself to reflect on how I benefited from white supremacy, however much the racial hierarchy punished my home community. That the UNC faculty community I embraced was constructed because of and reference to white supremacy, that I didn't exist apart from white supremacy, it was part of me. In the process of writing that editorial and a conference paper about Blackness and indigeneity, and another essay that would later appear in the New York Times, the depth of my sleepwalking dawned on me. Where were Indigenous people in this conversation? What about the fact that economic and social fabric woven to protect white supremacy, venerate the Confederacy, and denigrate Blacks was predicated on the erasure of Indigenous people, if not always literally from the population, then symbolically and narratively? Not just the polarized national media conversation, but the local, more nuanced conversation. The history of a more radical South was welcomed locally, but Indigenous people were still not part of it. How would indigeneity be captured in anti-racist work? On the other hand, those who wanted the statue and the veneration of the Confederacy on our campus to stay exactly as it was, argued for that position by claiming that our history would be erased and then lost. Who's we? When the last time you thought about Indigenous people was the news's coverage of Elizabeth Warren, don't waste my time acting like the victim when you are actually the aggressor. To not claim your status as the aggressor is ahistorical at best. Another, much larger group had maintained the invisibility of Indigenous people in a different way. I had spent my 4+ decades of life, 16 years of it working on UNC's campus, as an Indigenous person addressing rude and impertinent challenges from perfectly well-educated Native and non-Native people about how and why my community still existed. Over the years, people have said to me many varieties of, why don't you all just admit you're Black? As if the one-drop rule is completely legitimate when applied to American Indians and patently unfair when applied to the rest of America. Thousands of pages and hours in classrooms and tribal government offices across the country have been devoted to educating about the fact that American Indians can possess multiracial ancestry and still be American Indians. Especially at UNC, it's right in your face. And now you just willfully ignore that work? The value placed on education is awfully low if those facts are still ignored. My biggest, most mounting frustration was directed towards our university's administrators, including our chancellors and the Board of Governors, who for years, long before the statute resurfaced as an issue, had nurtured a culture of silent bystanding while elected officials worked to undermine public education at every level. Speaking for myself, this culture placed the onus on me to justify my existence at a university that proclaimed itself to be public, as in for the people. More broadly, it enabled white faculty and administrators to declare themselves incapable of cultivating an inclusive community because their skin color was the wrong shade, leaving faculty of color and Indigenous faculty to fulfill that mission while we ourselves were routinely excluded from decision-making and our research achievements, the only metrics on which we're judged and valued, diminished as we did so. It was urgent, imperative for our work as educators to enter the realm of advocacy. Every day, as part of the university's mission, we address these critical societal questions about belonging and identity. Whole fields and multiple disciplines with decades of research have accumulated about these questions, and white faculty who won't implement the most salient findings of that scholarship consider it service, not scholarship. The division between education and advocacy is false, designed to maintain a falsehood that the forces behind the status quo aren't in fact advocates. No, of course, they advocate as much as those who want change do. I have learned that they are advocating to maintain diversity work as service, not scholarship, because to bring it into the realm of rewardable scholarship might ask them to think differently about their own scholarship and the reward system in place for it. Many scholars have refused to give Indigenous people and frameworks of relationality their place in the conversation. After all, if they did so, they might have to give up some figurative and literal ground and admit that we're here and their causes are illegitimate without us. Then 2020 happened, y'all. So the twin pandemics of COVID and white supremacy converged. COVID-19 and the surge of protests in cities all across the country brought attention to the disproportionate death rates of Black people in America from both the disease and police violence. No one can deny that racism exists. The movement has been notable for its diversity, and Indigenous activists have been prominent in protests across the country. It's not surprising because they too have faced disease and police violence. But another obstacle faces both Indigenous and Black communities, and addressing it is essential to the success of systemic reform. Reclaiming shared histories that are forgotten or misremembered. Too often we discuss Black and Indigenous histories separately, when in fact both groups have experienced the structural forces we see playing out in these disproportionate death rates. Recalling and reckoning with inaccurate or incomplete narratives of the past doesn't just amplify the voices of Black and Indigenous communities, it also points to solutions to our present challenges. For instance, the spread of epidemic disease among Indigenous and African descended people was a result of policy as much as biology. Their societies had carefully adapted to epidemic diseases and their ripple effects before Europeans arrived in North America or Africa. Healers could remove contagions through medicine and spiritual practice. They imposed successful quarantines. They managed food systems despite seasonal uncertainty, redistributing food and other goods in order to sustain communities. European colonizers' disruption of those societies and these healing practices brought on the first genocides of Native people and the widespread deaths of African peoples, both on this continent and during the Middle Passage. Warfare and enslavement disrupted these communities and then prevented healers from doing their work and people from accessing medical and spiritual care. Displacement and famine followed. Death from disease was not inevitable. Rather, specific colonial policies, notably those that encouraged theft and used stolen resources to develop systems that valued property over people, made strong communities vulnerable. And then, when disaster struck, denied those same communities their own means of recovery and revitalization. Biology was then used by colonizers to justify such policies. Ibram X. Kendi, in his comprehensive history stamped from the beginning, discusses how both African and North American indigenous peoples were declared fit for enslavement by virtue of their biology. Observing that the genocide that flowed from disease, Spanish attorney Alonso de Zuazo wrote in 1510, "General license should be given to bring Negroes, a people strong for work, the opposite of natives, so weak who can work only in undemanding tasks." Biological justification for the enslavement of Africans and the elimination of natives paved the way for later settlers to rationalize their conquest. In the wake of a devastating epidemic in New England in 1633, English settler John Winthrop wrote, "The greatest part of the natives are swept away by the smallpox. So as God hath hereby cleared our title to this place, those who remain hath put themselves under our protection and freely confine themselves within certain limits." Winthrop justified native deaths, English settlement, and seizure of indigenous lands as part of a preordained hierarchy, a logic that intertwined biological and religious superiority. Colonizers imposed a biological, religious, and cultural hierarchy on people from both Africa and North America. That logic dictated that the victims deserved what they got, or that the outcomes were just natural extensions of European self-proclaimed superiority. This logic of victim blaming made it possible for the structure of military-style policing to germinate and grow among both communities. Some of these structures developed within the United States' most crucial eras, such as the Civil War and Progressive eras, when citizens fought to realize their visions for equality. These same time periods also brought state-sanctioned violence to Black and Indigenous people, especially as they tried to exercise their rights. Using militias, both formal and informal, to achieve whites' goals for their supremacy in the South and the West brought devastating consequences to the political rights of groups on the margins. For example, in 1864, 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children were massacred at Sand Creek in Colorado by Union Army units that had been functioning as a state militia since their return from fighting the Confederacy. Colorado was a kind of front of the Civil War, where white Westerners' investment in exterminating native nations matched white Southerners' investment in maintaining slavery. The massacre was politically orchestrated by Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans. Evans consistently issued inflammatory proclamations against Cheyenne and Arapaho inhabitants, accusing them of preparing for war against white settlers, all while Evans and the settlers under his jurisdiction flouted federal law to bring about war with indigenous people. Evans was so desperate to make Indians look like aggressors that he deliberately and consistently portrayed peaceful Cheyenne negotiators in the mantle of warlike chiefs. The Sand Creek Massacre killed many of those same peaceful chiefs, opening the way for settlers to seize Cheyenne land without negotiating at all. Evans's use of what was effectively a militarized police force led him to orchestrate atrocities without the approval of the federal government and to the deep detriment of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Then in 1898, between 60 and 300 Black men, women, and children were massacred in Wilmington, North Carolina by 2,000 white men who gathered in the city to eliminate the threat of Black prosperity that had accumulated since Reconstruction. Thousands more Black Americans were forced to flee their homes and businesses in Wilmington, leaving them to the mob to loot and raid. Property worth millions of dollars was transferred to white owners in this illegal coup, motivated by the success of Black voters in the state in helping establish a multiracial political party that would actually serve their interests. The Informal Militia, really a mob that held the tacit approval of the highest officials in North Carolina, was organized and led by senators and future mayors, congressmen, businessmen, a newspaper editor, and the first woman to serve in the US Senate. They sought to establish so-called good government, which, in the words of Governor Charles Aycock, rested upon the assured political supremacy of the white race. Black Americans' rights to participate in good government held no sway with the Wilmington insurrectionists, whose actions were officially supported by the state. Today, blaming the victim persists in police violence and the elected officials who make excuses for this violence. Accusing outside agitators of theft and property destruction is a common tactic to divert blame from the actual agitators. The faculty who co-created UNC's Roadmap for Racial Equity consistently face this accusation from UNC's leadership. Social media shows us more and more examples of police actively accosting protesters, not the other way around. When administrators illegally pay a hate group in a settlement concerning the ownership of the Confederate statue that used to be here, they are proving themselves to ally with outside agitators. It seems that these acts exist to justify portrayals of demonstrators, or in our case, faculty and students, not as Americans who want to be treated fairly, but as violent rioters who promote chaos. But unlike in the past, when aggressors cloak themselves in superiority to hide their theft and its consequences, this time, the winners won't write all the history. We have new evidence for who is causing the violence. If we are to change this product of systemic racism, we must properly remember the structure of theft that colonizers developed and stop blaming the victims. Black and Indigenous histories are intertwined, and the structural racism that both groups face now is a product of structures built in the past. These structures prompted the cascade of change brought about by European invasion and settlement, but they were not inevitable or accidental. Lies had to be told to maintain those structures against what was inevitable, the resistance of Black and Indigenous people to the violence committed against them. The structures of systemic racism were built upon a hierarchy of biological categories that required legions of scholars, politicians, religious figures, and ordinary men and women to construct. And it will take ordinary men and women to tear them down. For Black and Indigenous people, history is a source of nourishment from which we can continue to ensure this country live up to its founding principles. When we grasp Black and Indigenous histories together, we see that white supremacy is its own virus, one that alienates Americans from one another and blinds us to the culpable parties. When we take responsibility for this past, acknowledging its hypocrisies and honestly discussing benefits and who is denied due process in America, we begin a new world of living in relationship to one another instead of in opposition. On June 2nd, 2020, I felt free. That day, I realized George Floyd was born in my home territory. There is nothing more sacred than our ancestors and where they rest. No longer could I argue for the inclusion of Indigenous people in the past and future of racism and anti-racism. Instead, I began to see Indigenous and Black histories and futures as intertwined, both fundamentally dependent on each other. Telling them together changes the narrative completely. To tell them separately when our people are in community with one another is a desperate attempt to sustain white supremacy at the expense of our future. We are all on Indigenous land, and wherever you go, there are Indigenous people. Minneapolis, Southeastern North Carolina are bound not by Floyd's death, but by our kinship and survival in multiple places, claiming and sustaining our territories and our cultures. Many Indigenous people fear this shared story. On June 27th, Black students at UNC Pembroke, the campus founded by my ancestors and located in our homeland, organized a Black Lives Matter march in the town of Pembroke. They were joined by Lumbee, Black, and white members of the campus community and the town. They came to honor our ancestors and support the victims of police brutality. Lumbees and Blacks have collaborated on social justice issues at moments throughout history, especially in the 1860s and 70s and the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s. But white supremacy also divides these communities within themselves and between themselves in ways that support racial and status hierarchies. The June 27th demonstrators were met by Lumbees and whites who lined up on the other side of the streets of Pembroke opposite the marchers. They hurled beer, water bottles, and racial slurs at the marchers. Business owners in downtown Pembroke came with weapons, saying they were going to defend their property against looting. A Lumbee cousin, friend, and colleague of mine attended the march and wrote an essay about it, which I hope will be published soon. One of the divisions between Blacks, whites, and Lumbees in this moment, she wrote, and I'm just going to quote her at length. She said, the BLM march is not the first time I noticed that African American and other students were not always comfortable in Pembroke. Most students from outside Robeson County admit that before they come to UNCP, they heard that Lumbees will cut you. This is not to say that poor race relations on campus are all one-sided. Lumbee students have reported to me that African American students at UNCP have called them dumbies. In addition, most Lumbee students can report at least one time when they have been told that Lumbees aren't real Indians by other non-native students on campus. The grievances and victories on both sides are real. How do we sort all these out? Like the complex history of the Lumbee, I believe that the path forward is uncertain and likely will be interrupted by setbacks, but I still have hope. I have hope because I know there is still a chance to create spaces where young people can learn about each other's complex history and contributions to this country at UNCP and in our public schools. That was my friend Marianne. So for me, after following the rally on Twitter and Instagram and texting with friends and family, I felt like I had to say something in a public way. So I wrote a letter to the editor. Dear editor, at the Black Lives Matter march in Pembroke today, armed Lumbees protected their property as if property is more sacred than our neighbors' lives. Perhaps we have forgotten that European colonizers were the original looters, stealing people from Africa and land from our ancestors. The government's inept response to COVID steals our jobs now. People lined up today like they were at Lumbee homecoming, but instead of celebrating unity, they hurled beer, bottles, and racial slurs at UNC Pembroke students, faculty, and community members of all races. Our ancestors did not fight for our lives, only for us to turn around and abuse our neighbors, co-workers, and family members. Black lives matter to Lumbees because we have a responsibility to account for our own racism if we are ever to achieve our goals as an American Indian nation. What do Lumbees lose when Black lives matter? Nothing except our colonized minds. So when I speak, I'm talking specifically about my homeland, from my homeland, and about the work I have to do, that we must do. I cannot speak to the work that others must do. What happens here concerns me because this is where my ancestors are buried. George Floyd's roots are entangled with my own, and in a Lumbee way of thinking, roots are not past or dead. They are essential for the tree's continued survival. For Black and Indigenous lives, history is not a burden. It is a source of nourishment from which we can continue to ensure this country live up to its founding principles. When Black lives matter as much as white lives, all lives will matter. George Floyd is now an ancestor. Here, Black and Indigenous people have a right to be apart from, within, or between all of the identities and homelands that we possess. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lowery, for that amazing presentation that was just beautifully encapsulated so many of the ideas and observations that have actually been made over the last 2 days as well. I was thinking about especially the structure of theft and the ways that it keeps reoccurring, and also that this morning we heard a panel where Dr. Malinda Maynor talked about pandemics as a form of governance. And I was thinking, when you said policies, not disease, is what kills people. And the connections, and I'm excited for the Q&A. And we already have a question on chat that I'll read out to everybody listening in, because the questions come directly just to the panelists. And I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please use the raise your hand function, which is on the right-hand side of your screen at the bottom. And the first question is from Chloe Jackson, and she asks, You mentioned briefly the white rationalization of colonization and alluded to it when discussing the issue with the statue at UNC in 2015. What place does white rationalization have in academia? And how does this connect to formal versus informal education discussions that happen a lot in Black and Brown communities? I particularly think of many Brown grandmothers I've encountered who, while not having access to graduate education, are smarter than I'll ever be, truth. I hope this question makes sense. It makes perfect sense. I would love to just hear your thoughts.
Well, there's a lot of people on this call right now that can speak to this. White rationalization in academia is real and deep. I think in my various contexts as an undergraduate, you know, kind of through the course of my career in academia, you see it unfold in different ways depending on the stage of career you're at. I think often in mentorship on the graduate school level, but also as a junior faculty member, white rationalization looks like the rather persistent narrative that people of Black, Indigenous, or people of color do not belong here. The implication being that we are products of an unfair system, that the reason we're here is some phrase like affirmative action, which is, anyway, was very significant in my kind of upbringing in formal education. I was told many, many times that the only reason I was in a particular space at all was because of affirmative action, not because I had a place there, or because the academic space should include me. So affirmative action is an elaborate example of a racist policy, as Ibram Kendi would describe it. It's an elaborate, and that's I say that hearing how maybe surprising or unexpected it might be to hear that affirmative action is a racist policy. When you read his analysis of what a racist policy is, a definition and analysis, you can see quite clearly how a policy that leads to such rationalization, where the impact is that kind of rationalization, produces racism. It may not have been intended to support a racial hierarchy, but in fact its impact tends to be to support the same racial hierarchies that existed before the policy was created. So affirmative action is one narrative that I've seen over and over again in terms of various different stages of my career. Now that I'm a full professor, I think that narrative it comes to me less often. I'm just also blocking it out, but I'm somewhat immune to it, I suppose, now. And the more that you progress in your career, I find that sometimes the rationalization emerges through disciplinary conversations. So there's, depending on what disciplines you're in or intersection of disciplines, there are often so-called standards of rigor that are invoked when someone wishes to fundamentally exclude the perspective or the generative nature of a scholar's analysis. And so when I hear a word like rigor come up, my first sort of reaction is to check myself and say, wait, I need to get curious about that word, because I don't need to assume that my definition of rigor is the same as the person speaking right now. And let me get kind of curious and inquire, also before jumping to a conclusion, inquire about that definition of rigor and how it's being defined. So, these are, when I think of a keyword like rigor or another keyword like affirmative action, the impacts of these ideas tend to produce racial inequality, often more so or more deeply entrenched in any way than producing a kind of meritocracy that supposedly undoes racial inequality.
We have a question from Sophia Rikebi, who is a MURAP scholar. Sophia?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lowery. It's a very engaging conversation that you're having. So you talked about earlier how you felt as though, as an educator, you couldn't say as much as you wanted to about the silent salmon and engaging in these ways. As someone who wants to eventually become a professor at a university, what would you say is the best advice for those who want to engage in protest and or revolution, if revolution is even the right word, but want to highly engage in these sorts of protests? And like, I'm nervous about dealing with white supremacy within universities, but also how I fit within a hierarchy between not only students but those above me.
Sophia got muted, I think, but so I think there's so many places to start. Maybe that's one conclusion that I've drawn over the years, is that I think I waited too long, or the insights didn't come to me about why I needed to engage, because I thought there was like the best way to engage, or I thought there was a way to engage. And what I've realized is that there's not a way or a best way. There's like 1,000 different ways, and you just start somewhere that makes sense to you. Most especially, I think, with your peer group. So as you define your peer group, there's a professional peer group, there's a personal peer group, there's a community, many different types of groups that we engage with, and to which we want to belong, we want to feel like we belong. If we start with the things that we read, hear, see emerge coming from that peer group, then it really gives us a lot of helpful feedback to interrogate, where are we on this quest to anti-racism? And I think the fundamental entry point, to me at least, the one that you can have the most control over, you can make the most progress on the soonest, is the personal entry point, is to be able to evaluate, where am I on this journey towards creating an anti-racist society? Like, where am I on this journey to create a world in which our descendants won't know what race is unless they're told, unless somebody, an elder, has to sit them down and say, children, here's what racism was, here's what race was, here's what we did to move through it, to overcome it to some degree. So if I think about what I want that world to look like, or what I want to be saying, if I was in that world, what would I be saying in that world? Then it helps me understand where I am on this journey to actually create that world. And beyond the self-reflection piece, I don't know that you can do anything without self-reflection. So beyond that piece of it, I think being able to discuss with your peer groups where you are on this journey is one of the most important things that we can do. I think reading, studying, getting your research, like getting all that lined up is a given, especially if you're in this group already. If you've been working with this program and you're in this program, the fact that you're an excellent scholar whose standards of rigor can meet or beat anyone else's is a given. So trusting yourself, trusting your relationship to your profession, and knowing that you know what's best for you is critical. But I would say try not to spend maybe as much time convincing yourself to trust yourself as the time necessary to engage in this reflection, this rest, this really important space we need to imagine what the world we want to create is like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a question next from Dr. Gwen.
Hi, Malinda. I've gotten to know you this year through the academic leadership program. I got to see you every week in the spring. So I was just so grateful to share that space with you, and getting to know you better. I know that, you're this public intellectual, you are this incredible scholar, you are engaged with the Lumbee community. And then you talk about being, no longer sleepwalking, right? Being an activist on campus. And that just adds another sort of mound of responsibility for you, because I know how strongly you feel about all these other parts of your life and your career, right? And so I guess my question is, how do you, once you stop sleepwalking, how do you know which battles to fight? And how do you know, how do you
Fight all of them.
fall into so many things, right? Once you become a voice, once you become a leader, because you are on campus, people want more of you. And so how do you prioritize that?
That's a great question. And I wish I had an answer. I mean, you know, I'm developing an answer. One of my first answers, don't tell anybody, there's 50 people on this call. Are we recording? Go ahead and tell people. One of my first answers is to not do things that necessarily the administrative leadership, at least at the very top, are going to ask me to do. And I think that's a answer that's maybe is temporary. I mean, I could never say never, right? Somebody might come along that's doing something really great, and I'd be like, yeah, you know, sign me up. That sounds right up my alley. But in general, I think what I've learned on this campus, and I've taught previously at Harvard for several years in a tenure track capacity there, is that folks, it's almost like endemic to leadership at the very highest level in the academy that you have to take credit for other people's ideas, because you don't have ideas. You know, the top leadership here, and I think many other places, have very few original ideas, especially as it relates to questions of equity, diversity, inclusion, that is far outside their academic, social, intellectual bandwidth, right? So they have not spent decades and decades studying these issues. They haven't read the previous thousands of years worth of cultural and literary production from communities around these issues. So they don't have any innovative ideas. When they come to the table wanting to, engage with this issue, they will often reach in and pick the thing that seems to support their status much more than it does a substantive change on campus or otherwise. So I think if I have a kind of decent boundary, it's around to what extent is this thing I'm being asked to participate in coming from a place of intellectual rigor, there's that word, my definition of rigor, but to what extent is it coming from a place of intellectual authenticity that represents deep work and wrestling and expertise, rather than a place of, let me figure out a way to check a box to cease criticism that's coming at me from all corners, right? And unfortunately, I haven't yet seen a proposal for DEI work that emanates from top leadership that really results in substantive change. I've seen lots of proposals from students, from faculty, from all corners of the campus. And so those are the ones that I want to work on when I'm thinking about like how to spend my time. I don't know that I can make change in any of these areas, right? But typically what I've learned in this setting anyway is that if that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. And you want to work with people whose past behavior is consistent with your values and your sense of integrity. There's a better word than rigor, integrity. So if it doesn't resonate with me as a project that has, or an idea that has integrity, I can't work on it. That said, I work on 1,000 things because there's so many good ideas out there. The thunder is rolling, so yay.
It is even here. And then I think we have time for probably one or maybe two more questions. We have a question on chat from Michael Palm. Dr. Palm is actually building on Dr. Wen's question, and is asking to what extent should the university be the locus of struggle? And he's specifically thinking about Fred Morton's and Stefano Hani's Undercommons, and also the recent conference at Duke, the Abolitionist University, and would like to, I think this is a question probably from many of us, that how would you advise that we use the university to foment change beyond it, as well as to fight change in the university itself? I know that requires probably another, like.
Yeah, and Michael, you know a lot more about this than I do. As a leader of the American Association of University Professors chapter on our campus, as a co-president, you know, I would love to hear your advice on this. I mean, I think the one place to start is that the academy is as counterintuitive as its culture is compared to the kind of workplace environments that most of us actually do go on to after we leave college. Its culture of change is really counterintuitive. You know, it's coming and change comes from all directions. It usually still has to flow upwards rather than flow downwards. It's not very effective often when it comes from the top. But you know, in that way, I think the academy can be an interesting, not an exact mirror. It's not a reflection of certain kinds of communities, but it is an interesting mirror, or fairly fuzzy mirror, I guess, maybe circus mirror, of society at large. So you can see in the university power dynamics flowing in a lot of directions, and some unexpected ways, but then also some really typical and politically charged ways. So when you see what I notice at UNC and beyond is that when you see power flowing and influence flowing, it's worth taking note of the origin of that power, where it gets sort of as if it's an electric current, like where does it get stopped along the way? You know, what shuts it off and what can turn it back on? And how long does it take for that power to actually sort of reach its fulfillment? And so not everything is easily observable in a short period of time. That's the other thing about the university that's maybe not as much in some ways like society or the immediate political change that we require right now. At universities, it takes so much longer to unfold than it can in certain kinds of other pockets of American culture. But I think it is all, because it takes so long to unfold, you can see these power dynamics flowing, and you can take the time to kind of analyze them. And so that's not really an answer to the question, because, you know, I'm not sure how to harness this power that the university has. I do have one specific proposal, which is that if we could take our endowment income, right, this billions and billions and billions of dollars that get raised for lots and lots of worthy things. I mean, it's going towards good stuff and good people, right? It's given by, you know, people who really care about this environment. This billions of dollars, if we could take the income from that and invest a small percentage of that income, 0.5%, 1%, in a community development finance corporation. If we could invest it in a community bank, if we could take it to people with change that they want to make, that they need financing for. That's one really concrete way, one really obvious way for the university to make a direct impact on society. And that has to do, that then, you know, leads to a logic around not hoarding wealth, right? We can't hoard our wealth. We also can't hoard the knowledge that we generate and produce and that we teach in the classroom. It can't just stay in the classroom. But fundamentally, I think it's a larger project of using this university space to kind of analyze where society is at, or think about power and how it flows, because we can see it in certain ways here that helps us understand it in ways that are beyond here. We should have this conversation sometime. I'd like to know what everybody else here thought of that.
That's actually kind of an amazing proposal and would be amazing to sit down and discuss and think through. But it is also an amazing moment for us. It's like the perfect wrap up, like an actual, I'm amazed at the fact that you were able to bring all of these things together and then end with like a practical solution.
Well, I didn't come up with it either. I mean, that's a philanthropic leader that we had at UNC last fall at the center. You know, she came and she's like, here's what y'all need to do. And we're like, yes, oh my God, you know? So.
And I think that's the thing, that the universities have this, right? Like we have this knowledge that is never valued. And it goes back to actually the very first question that opened our Q&A, like what is considered rigorous?
Mm-hmm.
And there is a kind of a economy to that, right? A capitalist economy to that.
Yeah.
What is considered rigorous is what is valuable within white supremacist society.
You can pay for it.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like a really good time for me to hand this over to wrap up our session for the day and to give the closing remarks of the day. And just to say thank you again, Dr. Lowery, for that amazing presentation, for just being amazing in general, and for...
I feel like my daughter Lydia says, you're amazing. You're all amazing. Thank you.
I love what Dr. Caldwell put in the chat box. You're bringing the thunder, Malinda. It's thundering in Chapel Hill. So I just want to thank all of the provocative panelists today, capped off with this incredible presentation and discussion with Dr. Malinda Lowery. I know I've been personally nourished and inspired by both yesterday and today. And the good news is that we're not done yet. So we are continuing our conference on Monday. We have one more MURAP Scholar panel and a MURAP alumni panel. So if there are any alums here that have joined us, make sure to tell your friends, your MURAP, the MURAP alums to join us on Monday. We're going to have a fun session, you know, with some panelists who are alums, but also open it up to just a discussion about how MURAP has shaped your career and perhaps your life. And so you'll get to see some of your friends that you haven't seen in a while. So please send the message out there and make sure that your MURAP cohort joins us on Monday. Well, until then, have a wonderful weekend and practice whatever kind of care that feeds your soul. So thank you so much, and have a great weekend. Bye.